Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Escaping Atheism Project. I want to remind you, please give us a like, please give us a subscribe. And yes, we do need your financial and other support. Please check out all our vehicles on escapingatheism.com. Today, we're going to be interviewing someone we've interviewed before, Professor Stephanie Thomason. Professor Thomason is, well, I think she grew up Catholic, and then she became more or less agnostic, was exploring other spirituality, and then became a Christian again, not Catholic, but a Christian again. And in her previous, in her life, she is a professor of business, right?
Correct.
Yeah, you're a professor of business, but you've gotten into Christian apologetics. And I really enjoy your blog. People can find her blog at christianapologistweb.wordpress.com. Is that right?
That's exactly it.
She goes by Christian Apologist online. That's at lead1225 on Twitter, right?
Right, except I actually changed it to my real name. I just call S.J. Thomason.
S.J. Thomason, that's fine. We'll call you Stephanie today if that's okay.
That's perfect.
All right, Stephanie. So anybody who's interested in her background as a Christian and other background can check out her website and check out our previous interview with her. Today, we're going to be talking about a so-called historian who's ragingly popular in the atheist community named Richard Carrier. Now, this man, just so people know, people really should know, he does have a PhD in history, not from a particularly distinguished institution. And his work, he has very little work published that I'm aware of in the peer-reviewed historical journals. In fact, people don't seem to know this, but peer review is done not just in science, but it's also done in history. And respected historians work within their peer group a lot and subject themselves to scrutiny from their peers. Richard Carrier is famous for failing to do this, which is why, in point of fact, Richard Carrier is not a particularly credible historian. In fact, he's got real credibility problems, not just with his fellow historians, but with a lot of other people who've looked at his work and found gross, glaring inaccuracies in it. And before we get into Stephanie's recent controversy, I'm going to refer people on our escapingatheism.com website to a couple of articles you should look at. This is just one example. There are other people who will do this, but this is a strong one to get you with, or to start with. Look into a man named Borden Painter. I mention him a lot, but that's because he's one of the most distinguished historians in the world from Trinity College. Retired professor, has got an endowed chair in his own name at Trinity College, an extremely, extremely influential and respected historian at the world-class level. He's probably one of the most respected historians alive in the English-speaking world. We did an interview with him earlier this year, or maybe it was late last year. Yeah, it was early this year. And it's a three-part interview, but during parts one, and especially I think part two of that interview, Professor Painter does talk about Richard Carrier and basically considers Carrier a joke. Not to be taken seriously at all. In fact, he even mentioned, a paper, in the peer-reviewed historical literature, he challenged and dismissed Richard Carrier's work. So Painter is an unimpeachable source when I say Richard Carrier is not credible as a historian, regardless of what his PhD is, because any idiot can get well, not any idiot can get a PhD, but idiots can get PhDs, and that doesn't make them honest, and it doesn't make them credible. They managed to get through with the PhD. They can now go do whatever they want. Another guy who's like that is Sam Harris. If you have any doubts about that, we do have on our website, and I'll make sure to include a link to that in the low bar as well, Professor Painter's CV. You'll see that he's considerably more accomplished and considerably more credible than Richard Carrier. Now, to get into the specifics of why we're talking about the pseudo-historian, pseudo-scholar Richard Carrier today, is because Stephanie here on her blog, I'm showing you the page, and we will put the link on the low bar and on the Escaping Atheism page. Stephanie wrote an article called Resolving Controversies Surrounding Joseph of Arimathea and the Women Who Discovered Jesus' Tomb. It's quite a long and detailed article with plenty of references. Being a college professor and all, I think Stephanie knows something about documenting sources, I imagine. And Richard Carrier did not like this article. He didn't like it. I'm going to ask Stephanie about it, but to switch to Richard Carrier's own site, and let's hope he doesn't false flag us just for showing his site. We've had people claim we were violating their copyright just for showing their web pages before. Let's hope that doesn't happen this time. Anyway, you look at his response article. He starts in a way that is very typical for an ideological atheist and so-called skeptics. He just opens by attacking Stephanie, I mean, sorry. Just to quote him, he said, "You'd have to pay me to waste time on any of the millions of amateur Christian arguments on the internet." This is Carrier talking. But of course, that being the case, occasionally someone does. Okay, so the benefactor, he said, basically he was paid just to respond to Stephanie's article. And the immediate thing he says is that she has no relevant credentials. No relevant credentials. Classic ad hom. It's not to go after the content, it's to go after the person. Atheists complain, by the way, about ad hom when somebody is insulting or dismissive of them, but that's not what an ad hom argument is. Somebody can call you a jerk, and that's not an ad hom. Ad hom is when you say you can dismiss what someone says based on who they are alone. That's what an actual ad hom argument is. And it's garbage. Anybody who looks can check and see Professor Thomason's original article is well documented. Anyway, Carrier goes on and on and on to try to deconstruct this article, and he's got real problems in a number of things he's claiming here, doesn't he, Stephanie?
Yeah, you know, the purpose of the article was to take the documentation of the empty tombs from the 4 different Gospels and unite them. And the beauty of the Gospels is that when you unite them, you actually learn a lot more about what they have to say. And the empty tomb accounts actually unite quite well. And so he didn't really appreciate that. He wants to pretend like there's gospel errors.
The fact of the matter is that you can debate how to interpret any part of the Bible or even other seriously complicated and ancient texts. But it's like Carrier thinks he's doing something new and original, or at least his fans seem to think he's doing something new and original. But I've read anti-biblical analyses of the 4 Gospels like him, like what he wrote, many times. Claims that the Gospels, actually a lot of the claims are almost incoherent. For example, just to pick one, he and his fellows seem to think that if the named authors of the 4 Gospels weren't the actual authors, like if the Apostle Mark didn't actually write the Gospel of Mark, that would destroy Christians and their credibility. But in ancient times, that wouldn't have been seen the case. And while most Christians firmly believe the Gospel authors are who they said they were, if it turned out that someone who knew them had written them and put them in their name, that wouldn't be unusual. In ancient times, people did that a lot. It wasn't even considered plagiarism. It was considered somehow normal.
Well, there was an oral tradition back then. So a lot of work was passed down orally, and they prized the oral tradition. And the other thing is it was attributed to these 4 people. So even if they didn't author it themselves, even if it were authored by scribes, it's attributed to those 4 people.
Which was normal behavior. And by the way, a lot of Christians still run by oral tradition, but some don't. In any case, yeah, that wouldn't be a disqualifier for the accuracy of any ancient account if somebody, because it was considered sort of giving someone a tribute if you wrote something in their name and attributed it to them. Although it would also have been considered rather holy. You don't distort them or mess them up. But it was common. There are respected historical documents that are considered historically valid that for thousands of years people have questioned, well, is that the real author? And when looking at ancient documents, who the real author is not always the most relevant question, just in general terms in history, right? I mean,
no, you know what's beautiful is historians ask for 2 sources of information, and within 150 years of the time Jesus was crucified, we have 42 independent sources of information. 33 of them are Christian, and then we have 9 actually non-Christian secular sources of proof and validation of the New Testament.
That's correct. In fact, even in today's academia, which is not exactly a Christian-friendly place in most of the English-speaking world, and certainly not dominated by Christians, even there, the overwhelming number of biblical scholars, including atheist and agnostic scholars, find it ludicrous to suggest that Jesus didn't exist, and generally haven't been kind to the kind of analyses that Richard Carrier gives.
That's true.
Yeah, among respected historians, Richard Carrier is not one. He got a PhD. Okay, well, to be honest, there are countless people with PhDs who are teaching high school or similar, not particularly glorious jobs, because the demand for qualified historians is limited, and the really good ones, well, they don't look or act at all like Richard Carrier, do they?
No, I do have to say, though, Richard Carrier did graduate from Columbia, which is a respected institution, but I don't believe he holds an academic post now. He indicated to me that he travels a lot and he's promoting his books. So he's an author.
Yeah, he travels to promote himself. He goes to atheist conferences and so-called secular conferences and publishes books. This is how he makes his living. He is a professional atheist. He's not a professional historian. He's a professional atheist. And it's important to remember that. Okay, so let's go into some of the points you've made. You did give a point-by-point rebuttal or response to Richard Carrier, right? A 15-point Christian response to Richard Carrier.
Yes.
I'd like to see him take on Bart Ehrman sometime, since Ehrman's an agnostic, not Christian at all. He'd probably back you up on a lot of this. But what were some of the things you had to say to Professor Carrier? Not Professor Carrier, Richard Carrier.
Well, for example, in the first point, he says, Paul didn't mention the empty tomb, Jesus' burial, or a missing body. But you don't need to mention all of those things to say that Jesus resurrected. It's not required that you mention all of those kind of things. For example, if a woman said that her husband died and was buried, we don't need to know that the details about the tomb in which he was buried. So just one example. There are many examples. The Gospels name no authors, he said, and he uses the word kata. Kata translates to according to. The Gospels are according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, so there's nothing wrong with saying that. He says that the Gospels all copy Mark, but actually that's not true. Even if Matthew and the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Luke copied Mark or used some of Mark's material, we know that John is completely original. Those are just several examples.
I'm often annoyed by things like this because I often see popular atheists, which is, again, what people like Carrier is. He's a pop historian addressing a pop audience and frequently saying things that are either not true or are like, he's twisting things that have been known for centuries. People have been looking at the authorship of the various Gospels and speculating on source materials used for a long time. I think many think that Mark was the first. Most seem to think Mark was the first Gospel written, and that at least 2 of the other Gospel authors relied on Mark. There's also, for the longest time, been theorized that there is a document dubbed simply Q. I forget what Q stands for, but it's the theoretical Q document, which may have been another source now lost that the Gospel authors relied on or copied from. Again, we've known that for a really long time, longer than anybody in this conversation has been alive. Go ahead.
Max, even if we only had John's account, or we only had Matthew's or Mark's or Luke's or some of these extra biblical materials, we have enough material from all of these different sources to indicate that Jesus resurrected. And the other thing, actually, let me mention something with Carrier that was my 4th point. Carrier said that the women who went to the empty tomb never told anyone, as per Mark 16:8, but actually that's not true. Mark 16:8 doesn't say that they never told anyone. They said nothing to anyone at that particular point. So the point, so he just added the word never to put it in their entire lifetime. They never said anyone, but the other three gospels actually explain what happened after. And then Carrier lied about Tacitus, which actually was crazy. I went into Tacitus's exact quote. Carrier said that he had people killed because of a specific act of arson. He didn't say that he had people killed because they were Christians, but in Tacitus' quotes, he makes it very clear that he killed people because they were Christian.
You know, you just used a word that needs to be used more often. I know not everybody who's wrong about something lies, but at this point, being a professional atheist who purports to be a historian, waving his PhD in everybody's faces, calling him out for lying is, I think, important, and the word lie is correct. Richard Carrier has lied on his website about historical documents and completely misrepresented Tacitus, didn't he?
Exactly, exactly.
And liars lie, people, so if he'll lie about something this big, what else will he lie about? And I will send this to him, and I'll call him a liar to his face, because he is a liar. He deserves to be discredited for this sort of pseudo-scholarship.
Exactly.
Now,
even, as you said, even historians who are agnostic, atheist, Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, they all say that Jesus walked the earth. Whether or not they regard him as a divine, they say that he walked the earth. So it's irresponsible of him to say he didn't.
That's right. He's openly miseducating the public. Maybe you don't believe the gospel accounts, or at least maybe you believe they're, like some do, maybe you believe they're partially true, and the miracles didn't actually happen, and we can have that conversation. But we can't have an honest conversation with somebody who's just making crap up. And so why would you even take someone seriously if he does start making stuff up like this? I see it as point 6. He says, at your point 6, you quote him as saying, plenty of religions are begun with visions. Oh, gee, Richard, like nobody knew that. In fact, Carrier also seems to rely on the idea that that Christians automatically assume that there is no truth in other religions, and that nothing spiritual happens to people who aren't Christians. Nothing real spiritual happens to people who aren't Christians. And that is not a Christian belief at all.
No, exactly.
Nor do we don't necessarily think the other religions are demonic per se. That's another conversation. But it is a myth to say that Christians think any non-Christian who had a religious vision or experience, that experience was false. Who thinks that? Do you?
No, absolutely not. I have friends who are in other religions. I have Hindu friends, I have Buddhist friends, I have Muslim friends, and I don't doubt for a minute that if they tell me they had an experience that was spiritual, that they actually had the experience that was spiritual. I don't doubt that at all.
No, and there is, by the way, I've said it many times before, I'll say it again, there is no scientific or medical justification for simply asserting that all religious visions or spiritual experiences are delusional. You may have that as an opinion, but there's no science that says that. You can't prove such a claim. You're making an unscientific claim if you make it. You can think that religious experiences are all psychological, and all, but that's just an opinion, and it's not particularly deserving of any more respect than any other opinion that I can determine.
What's interesting is some atheists say that they do have spiritual experiences. So I find it curious that they have spiritual experiences, but yet they don't account for what exactly is the source of those spiritual experiences.
Right. They'll usually assume it's some kind of emergent effect of the electrochemistry of their brain and something like dreams, and it's all false and it's all just imagination, which I think is, you can defend that point of view, but you can't assert that that point of view is factual at all. And there's reasons to question whether that's true or not, especially because perfectly sane people with no history of mental illness before or after often report spiritual experiences, don't they?
Yes, exactly.
What I see here is a trend. Like at point 7, you quote Carrier saying, Luke, meanwhile, never says he witnessed anything. Wow, so St. Luke never says he personally witnessed anything. And what is the relevance of that at all? Because he didn't think to mention it. He didn't think to put in a sentence, By the way, everybody, I was there and personally saw all this. Did he need to write that? I don't even understand what his point is.
I don't understand the point either, because Luke quite clearly believes in Jesus and believed Jesus resurrected, and he traveled with Paul. He documented that starting from Acts 16, that he traveled with Paul. And we know that in the book of Acts, there were quite a few miracles, which the apostles were directing, including Paul.
Yeah, I don't understand what he's on about, except that I think this is pretty typical for pseudo-scholars of Carrier's variety. And yes, I'm using harsh words on him. He deserves it. All right, at your point 8, you say, we have no eyewitness testimony from Peter. And that 2 Peter, 2 Peter, which is one of the New Testament books, is recognized by all mainstream scholars as a forgery. And 1 Peter never claims to have witnessed anything. Excuse me, the word forgery, I have a problem with that.
I do too. He can't make the claim in any way that all mainstream scholars make that claim. All don't.
No, and there's some weasel wording there too, because his use of the term forgery is a very modern perspective in the first place. As we noted at the beginning, it is incredibly common with ancient documents, not just spiritual documents, but respected historians, people. You might find some things attributed to Tacitus, for example, and there might be reason to think that it wasn't actually Tacitus who wrote it. And if people found that out at the time, that would not discredit the work, because it was not an uncommon practice. Nor was there any concept of something called copyright, nor did people make money selling books or things like that. And so copying things from others or attributing them to others was simply a common practice. It's only in the modern era that we look down on that at all. Isn't that right? Exactly.
And even so, just consider the content, consider the motivations of the apostles to write this material in the first place, or to have the material attributed to them. In the first 300 years, they practiced illegally, and many of them were crucified. All sorts of things happened to them that were awful. They had no motivation or tangible incentives to do this.
Exactly correct. There were no tangible motivations. You may, if you wish, believe these men were all deluded. Okay, fine. You're allowed to have that opinion. But history clearly shows that almost all the original apostles wound up facing persecution. None of them got rich that we know. Most of them were martyred. I know John died of old age, but I'm not sure any of the others did. I'm pretty sure most or all of the others were murdered.
Exactly. Peter was hung upside down. We know Paul was beheaded. They did not face easy lives. They did not receive any sort of tangible benefits by worshiping and praising Jesus. They received all sorts of beatings, everything else. So there's nothing to indicate that they were benefiting by writing this material.
Exactly. Let's move on to the 9th point in your article here. You quote Carrier saying, in Judea, only Stephen is killed, and not by having been convicted of anything, but by, in effect, a rioting mob. Well, man, he packs so many things into one sentence. Go ahead. What did you say in response to that?
It's lies. He completely lies. If you go into the book of Acts, it makes it quite clear that that Stephen was speaking according to the elders, blasphemous words, and they brought him before the Sanhedrin.
I think he can only get away with this stuff because in today's world, so many people haven't read the Bible and haven't studied it at all and know nothing about it. Let's move on to his point 10. I'll quote him again. Christian apologist, aka Stephanie here, wants to claim Mark and Matthew are eyewitnesses and admits Luke is not, yet Mark and Matthew have no knowledge of Peter ever seeing an empty tomb. I'm trying to count. Is that like 4 lies in one sentence? How does he do that? Go ahead. Well,
it's terrible. It's almost amusing to listen to this, because we know for a fact that all of the disciples were hiding out right after Jesus died. Peter was at the empty tomb. Peter went back to where the disciples were hiding, and he proclaimed, obviously, what did he say when he got back there? Clearly, he must have told them that he saw the empty tomb. And then he saw Jesus. They all saw Jesus, and that's documented.
Yeah, they could have been lying, but I suppose. I mean, I don't think they were. They could have been lying, I suppose, but there's no justification for these claims that Carrier is making.
No.
In fact, to say that you want to claim Mark and Matthew are eyewitnesses is to suggest that somehow this is your own invention in your pretty little brain. like no one ever. I understand why some people just don't want to respond to people like Carrier, because untangling the spaghetti web of assertions gets really hard. At point 11, you quote Carrier again. Carrier says, in dating the Gospels, J. Warner Wallace, an ex-cop, is cited. So again, we have a little bit of Carrier's credentialism here. Mr. Carrier, even though you do have a PhD, I know, and from Columbia, fine. I note there's plenty of people on with PhDs in history, even from distinguished universities, who haven't done jack in history or done anything to forward the field of history. And so going after somebody else's credentials, why don't you tell us what J. Warner Wallace got wrong? That would be useful.
That would be useful, because I don't think he got anything wrong. I think J. Warner Wallace has done an excellent job in apologetics.
His book is Cold Case Christianity, right? Isn't that it, the case?
That's one of his books. He's been writing books, a few books now, and he's done a wonderful job. I would highly recommend those books to anyone who wants to read up on Christianity and apologetics and all that kind of good stuff.
You know, even though he's an evangelical and I'm a Catholic, I gave his Cold Case Christianity to my son, who was flirting with atheism, and he was really impressed with it. And again, we have a bit of disingenuousness at best out of Carrier here, because J. Warner Wallace is a former homicide detective, extremely well trained on the topic of forensics. And he has looked at the historical and scientific evidence we have of the existence of Jesus of Nazareth extensively, and analyzed it and built a case that would probably convince a jury using science and documented sources. Go ahead.
Let me mention this also. He was an atheist. He was raised as an atheist. His parents are atheists, and he came to the conclusion that Christianity was true based on his forensic studies.
Yeah, I'd like to know if Richard Carrier is about to assert now that police forensics, that police homicide detectives trained in forensics, if they're pseudoscientists or not credible. I'd like him to say if he thinks that of people trained in criminal forensics. I would like to see him back up any such insinuation. I suspect that the average homicide detective, let alone J. Warner Wallace, knows his job better than Richard Carrier does. All right, at your point 12, Carrier claims that Papias said nothing about authorships of the Gospels, and Eusebius is not credible. Those are some mighty big assertions, aren't they?
They're lies. I hate
Straight
to
up,
say it.
they're BS.
They're lies, complete lies. And I actually cited a source where you can find information about what Papias did say, and also backing by Eusebius.
I don't. What's his justification for saying Eusebius isn't even credible? What?
He doesn't give it. Just like he said, I'm not credible. He says that anyone who says that Jesus is not a myth is not credible. So he just makes stuff up.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. All right, here's a longer one. Notice how, again, he just always makes it about you rather than your arguments. But that's okay. We're making this about him at this point. Let's quote Carrier again. But the bigger problem is that harmonizations like hers are not credible. According to who? Because that is not how any real police investigator or historian reconstructs events. Really? I'm not going to keep reading. What do you say to that?
That's crazy. That's exactly how forensics, in forensics, that's exactly how you reconstruct events. You gather information from multiple people and you piece it together.
So maybe we should get him in. Maybe we should have a little fundraiser and get the tuition funding at Richard Carrier's local community college on introductory forensics, so he can learn something about that science. Yes, that was snarky, but really, holy cow, how does this guy get away with what he does? Point 14, Carrier says, Jesus would have been buried in the Sanhedrin tomb complex, left there on countless shelves among hundreds of other corpses in varying states of decay. What? Are the gospel accounts not clear that a fairly wealthy man donated his tomb?
The gospel accounts are quite clear. And even if they had made that up, if they said, basically, I get very frustrated when I read something like this because it's so insulting to Jesus. Look what he did for us.
You know what? I'll even go back to it. I mean, I know you're speaking from a very Christian perspective. I try to speak from a secular perspective, and even from a secular doubter or non-believer point of view, Carrier's got a real credibility problem. Let's look at his last point that you addressed, and then we'll chat a little bit and we'll end this conversation with some closing thoughts. So Carrier, quoting Carrier again, Joseph of Arimathea is a, quote, symbolic and starting over. Joseph of Arimathea is symbolic and allegorical from a fake town. Really? Okay, what's the basis of that claim?
Let's just go back and realize who Joseph of Arimathea was. Joseph of Arimathea was in the Sanhedrin group, so there's no reason for anyone to craft a fake story about a person in the Sanhedrin. If they were going to make this up, they would have said that he was basically one of them. They wouldn't have made up that a person, a member of the Sanhedrin would have buried Jesus in his tomb.
I will show anybody who cares right at the bottom. Professor Thomason, Stephanie's article here is very well referenced in materials you can find. Well, of course, she's a professor. I mean, I got to ask you, if you had a student write a paper like this, I imagine you'd give him an F. Not for contradicting you, but just for making crap up.
I would, yes. That would.
And I'll tell you, I'll quote Professor Borden Painter again, who I've mentioned before. Yeah, he said people like Carrier would just get an, if an undergraduate wrote like people like Richard Carrier, they'd get an F. And if they were academic historians who published stuff like this, I mean, Painter doesn't reference this article, but other of Carrier's material is similar, they'd be in serious academic problem. They might lose their jobs, not because they question the Christian accounts, but because his methodologies are just not credible, are they?
No, he said, I mean, just bald-faced lies in here. Bald-faced lies. He lied about what was said in Acts. He lied about what Tacitus said. If you look at these quotes, you can see what he's saying is a complete lie. And so I asked Richard Carrier, I said, you know, I thought Richard Carrier was hiding out after I published this because he didn't say anything for about a day. And so I said that maybe his benefactor had asked for his money back. But then the benefactor perked up and said that, no, he wasn't asking for his money back.
I don't know how to tell Richard Carrier fans that their hero is a nothing among historians. He truly is. He got his PhD and, like Sam Harris, did nothing academic with it, simply ran off and began spouting off opinions using that PhD as if it automatically grants him credibility. But just having a PhD doesn't automatically grant you credibility for the rest of your life, does it, Stephanie?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. And, you know, it really means that you have a specialization in one field. It definitely doesn't mean you're an expert in all fields.
That's right. So the thing is that this matters not just because, not because we're just siding with Stephanie per se, but we really want people to hear it. There is such a thing called a professional atheist, and they peddle a product. And many of them will straight up lie to you. And so while many atheists and non-religious skeptics who aren't sure what they believe should realize, if you're going to talk about being skeptical, and many of them say it's important to learn skepticism, there's problems with skepticism, but whatever. If you're going to believe that skepticism is a good thing, I suggest you have the guts to get skeptical of the people you like and admire. So if you like and admire people like somebody like Richard Carrier, I would suggest you have the courage to get skeptical of him and begin investigating his claims. because I think you're going to find that if you do, there's a lot of problems here, and with a lot of other people on the same cultish lecture, book-selling talk tour. What do they call that when people...
Yeah, it's a tour. That's a good word for it.
Public speakers. Yeah, but public speaking tour. He's on the public speaking circuit. There's a market for atheists and anti-Christians and atheists in general. And there's a market for these books, and they're meeting that market demand. But that doesn't mean at all that they're being honest or responsible scholars in any way. It is completely irresponsible. Even if you don't believe the gospel accounts, even if you believe that the Bible is basically wishful thinking and fantasies and all that, the methodologies and the assertions being made by Richard Carrier and others in his group are simply false to the historical record, and academically would get them bounced out of any respectable institution. It just would. And I don't know what it takes to get through to people so that they can hear that.
Let me make another point, because you mentioned Sam Harris. I wrote a rebuttal to Sam Harris's piece as well. One thing I do give him credit for is that he does acknowledge the fact that we have objective moral standards.
Yeah, but he can't. But Harris can't explain why, or he just suggests that we evolve them and we have them naturally. That's
true, but at least he acknowledges that, and I think that's that first step up the ladder to God. So I think if people realize that we have objective moral standards, at some point they start looking for the source.
Right, because if you accept that moral standards are just social constructs, you've essentially declared that there is no morality. Because if I reject your social constructs, or another society has a completely different set of values, you know, in an atheistic universe, there is no reason to call one set of values better than another. So if I want to murder 6 million Jews because I find Jews loathsome for some reason, by what moral standard do you say I'm wrong? In my society, it's okay to murder Jews. In my society, it's okay to murder whatever, children, you know, Croatians. By what moral standard would you condemn someone for any of that? If morality is not universal and it's a social construct, you've got no basis to even condemn someone like Adolf Hitler, do you? Maybe he was right all along. Who were you to say he was wrong, right?
Exactly. And we all look back on that and we realize that was horrible. And we all call to the same sense of justice in saying that was treason against humanity. Exactly.
All right, everybody. Well, I think we've made our points here. I urge you to check out Christian Apologist Web on WordPress. We'll have the link in the low bar and on escapingatheism.com. So that you can look at Carrier's article, both of Stephanie's articles, and the other materials we've referenced here. Do you have any parting thoughts for us, Professor Thomason?
I just said, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life.
Yes, I have to agree with you there. And by the way, it's not at all irrational to believe in God or to believe in the existence of Jesus. I think that when atheists accuse believers of wishful thinking, I think they need to look in a mirror, because I think Richard Carrier and his fans want to believe the things he's saying, even though he can't credibly back them up. All right, everybody.
Let me just say one thing. I think that if people just look at Jesus's life, for no other reason, if we can just imitate and live like he lived, it makes us better people.
Even when I was an atheist, I recognized that religions like Christianity had a more positive than negative effect on people, for sure. All right, everybody.
Nietzsche realized that too. Nietzsche,
yeah. I mean, although he was very ardently opposed to the idea of God, he at least took it seriously. And he took, you know, I know that the great atheist Nietzsche especially hated the Apostle Paul's writing, but he addressed Paul, and he considered Paul an enemy to his way of thinking about the world. But he didn't lie about Paul, and he didn't make crap up. And I think that's the most important take home, everybody. Watch out. Atheists will accuse religious people of making things up and of wish fulfillment and wishful thinking. Atheists can be guilty of the exact same thing. And it appears to be the case in people, pseudo-scholars really, like the pop historian Richard Carrier. All right, everybody, we're going to close up now. So thank you for joining us. I want to thank Professor Thomason for joining us again.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'll include a link to our original interview with her, which was great. I'm hoping to get her on again sometime soon to talk about other spiritual experiences she's had. But in any case, to remind you, please give us a like, please give us a subscribe. And yes, we do need your financial and other support. So please check us out and tell your friends and enemies. God bless everybody.
Thank you.